Dela behind the barn. A pistol, a past, and a choice. The sun had barely lifted its weight over the eastern ridge when Lawson noticed something wrong. It wasn't the stillness of the morning or the uneasy shift of the horses in their pen. It was the way Neil, his hired hand, stood frozen by the barn eyes fixed on the shadows behind it. Lawson came up, a slow rifle resting in the crook of his arm, and that's when he saw her. She was crouched low, half hidden behind a stack of split wood. Dust clung to her like a second skin, and blood darkened the corner of her mouth. Her coat hung loose at the shoulders, frayed and too big like it had once belonged to a man now gone. And in her hands, small but clenched with purpose, was a Colt 40, its barrel shaking just enough to betray her fear. Lawson didn't move quick. He raised the rifle slow, steady, more out of instinct than intent. "You planning to shoot?" he asked, voice even, or just holding that for comfort. For a moment, nothing changed. Then her shoulders sagged under some invisible weight, and the gun dipped with them. "I ain't here to steal," she said, voice rasping like wind through dry corn stalks. "Just needed a place to breathe." Lawson scanned her boots that didn't fit, elbow torn open, and on her wrist a burn raw and pink in the shape of a cattle brand. Yet it was her eyes that made him pause. Wild, yes. Worn out, but clear. Clear in the way truth sometimes is. He didn't lower his rifle just yet, but his grip softened. "You got a name?" he asked. She hesitated. "Dela Orvin." He exhaled through his nose, lowered the barrel. "You hungry, Dela?" She nodded once, like swallowing her pride was the price of staying alive. "Then let's get you fed. A meal and a name that doesn't belong to." Trouble Lawson's ranch sat about 9 miles south of Helena, tucked quiet between hills. Too stubborn to grow anything but brittle grass and the scraggly edge of the tree line. It wasn't a place meant for strangers. Wasn't a place meant for much change at all. But that morning, with a half-starved girl at his side and dust still clinging to her lashes, the quiet didn't hold the same peace it usually did. Inside the kitchen still smelled like the beans he'd scraped together the night before. He didn't ask questions, just scooped a plate and slid it across the table. Dela sat on the edge of the chair like it might bite, but once the food touched her hands, she ate like someone who hadn't seen a full plate in days. Lawson watched not with suspicion, but curiosity, the kind that rises when the world hands you a story you didn't ask for. She wiped her mouth with her sleeve, straightened her spine, and finally met his eyes. "I didn't steal that horse," she said, jaw clenched. "Or the money. They just needed someone to blame after the foreman's boy went missing." Lawson didn't respond right away. He'd learned that silence often said more than words. He studied her face, saw the tightness in her shoulders, the way her hands twitched like they missed holding that pistol. "You're running from someone?" he asked. She nodded. "The sheriff from Fort Benton, and anyone else he lied to. You got folks? None that want me back?" Lawson rubbed his brow. He hadn't meant to get involved. He had cattle to move, fences needing mending. But something about her, maybe the way she held that gun like it was the only thing keeping her upright, stuck with him. She wasn't just running from trouble. She was running from being erased. The gun, the fire, and the first lessons in trust I don't take in runaways. Lawson said, careful not to put too much weight behind the words. He expected her to flinch, maybe beg. But Dela stood fast fire, flickering back into her eyes like the embers of a storm not yet put out. "Then I'll be on my way," she said flatly. "I didn't say I was sending you off either." He met her stare without blinking. "You shoot, I can aim." "Not well." "Then teach me." A beat passed, long enough for the dust to settle. "I will." Why he hesitated. "Because I know what it means to be blamed for something you didn't do." That got her. She didn't say anything, but her shoulders loosened just enough. And maybe that was the moment trust began, not with promises, not with oaths, but with the simple fact that he saw her not as a problem to solve, but as someone trying hard not to drown. That night she slept in the barn, curled beside a bale of hay like a fox waiting for morning. Lawson didn't press her. He left a blanket, a second plate of beans, and locked the door from the outside just in case, not to keep her in, but to keep the world out. On the fourth night she stood in the doorway, hat in her hands. "I won't stay long," she muttered. "You'll stay until you can defend yourself," he said. "Long as that takes." A new morning and the weight of an older name. The days that followed were quiet, but not empty. Dela didn't speak much, and Lawson didn't ask her to. She kept mostly to herself, sleeping in the barn, even when frost touched the edges of the window panes. Each morning, Lawson left a blanket folded neat on the stool by the door, a bowl of whatever he'd cooked, and a tin cup of black coffee beside it. She never thanked him, and he never waited to be thanked. But on the fourth morning, just after the rooster crowed and before the sky lightened fully, she appeared in the doorway of the house. Her hair was braided back, hat in her hands, boots scraped of mud. She looked smaller somehow, though not afraid. Just hesitant. "I won't stay long," she said, voice soft. "You'll stay until you can defend yourself," Lawson replied, without looking up from the coffee he was pouring. Dela stepped inside. Didn't sit, but didn't turn back either. The quiet stretched long between them until she finally moved to the table. Out back, he set up 3 glass bottles on the fence posts, spacing them like he had for his brother when they were boys. The first time Dela fired, she missed everyone. Her shoulders were too tight. Her grip was all panic and no purpose. But she didn't curse, didn't pout, just adjusted her stance and tried again. By the third day she hit 2. On the 5th she broke all 3 in a single line faster than he expected. Lawson nodded once. "Keep this up. You'll shoot straighter than any son I never had." She looked over, surprised. A flicker of something moved behind her eyes. Not pride, not yet. Maybe wonder. "You ever want one?" she asked. He nodded. "I did." They didn't speak more after that, but something shifted as quiet and sure as the turn of a weather vane. The rifle. Across her knees, and the first confession. It was still early when Lawson stepped outside and saw her sitting on the porch with his old rifle across her lap. She cradled it like a memory, not a weapon. Her fingers resting gentle on the barrel, the stock steady against her thigh. Morning light softened the edges of her face, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she looked less hunted. "I used to be good," she said, not looking up. Lawson leaned against the porch rail. "At what? Living quiet," she said. "Had a job in Fort Benton, washing dishes. Saved up for a saddle." Her voice dropped. "Then that boy went missing. Folks said I took the horse. Took the money. Sheriff didn't need proof, just someone to burn." She didn't cry, but her jaw set hard enough to crack. He turned up 3 days later, drunk, passed out in the next town, but the sheriff already had me branded. She looked up then. "I don't know how to be anything else now." "You're not a thief," Lawson said. She blinked, unsure. "You sound sure." "Because I see you. He said it like it was a plain fact. You're strong, honest. Just need someone to believe it. She turned toward him. Really turned like she was seeing him for the first time. Why are you being kind to me? Lawson didn't flinch. Because you deserve better than what the world handed you. Her jaw trembled, but she held herself steady. You keep saying things like that, she whispered. I might start to believe them. He reached out, touched her hand. She didn't pull away. That night she moved into the house. No words were said. She just set her bag by the door, took her plate at the table, and sat like she belonged. A sheriff rides in and a man draws his line. 3 weeks passed without trouble. The frost thickened. The fence posts creaked in the cold. And then one afternoon Lawson saw a rider coming down the trail. The dust cloud curled low behind him, slow, deliberate. Lawson stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, before the man even reached the gate. The sheriff from Fort Benton dismounted, boots crunching gravel. I'm looking for a runaway, he said. Dela Orvin. She's wanted. Lawson didn't blink. She's not here. You sure about that? Lawson stepped forward close enough to see the sheriff's eyes narrow. You just turned your horse around, Sheriff. No one here by that name. No one you need to bother. The lawman's gaze slid toward the barn, then the house. You harboring a criminal, I'll say this once. Lawson's voice was like gravel in a steel pan. You ride back with 5 men or 50, but bring a coffin too. The sheriff didn't respond, just pulled his reins tight and turned back toward the trail. Inside, Dela watched from the window, hands clenched. You didn't have to lie, she said later. I didn't lie, Lawson replied. You're not the girl he's looking for anymore. She stepped closer. Because of you, he shook his head. Because you let yourself grow. Her fingers brushed his face. Lawson, yeah, I think I'm falling for you. He smiled, slow and honest. Then we're in the same trouble. She kissed him on the porch with the wind kicking up and the sun dropping low behind the hill. She fit against him like she'd always belonged. And for the first time in a long while, Lawson let himself believe in tomorrow. A new kind of stillness and the feeling of belonging. The next morning broke soft and gray, the kind of quiet that felt like a held breath. The frost had deepened during the night, painting the windows with silver veins. Dela stirred early. Feet bare against the chill of the floorboards, moving slow so as not to wake Lawson. He lay still under the quilt, one arm draped across the bed, the other tucked beneath his pillow, breathing easy in the peace of sleep. At the basin, she washed her hands in cold water, staring out at the mist that clung to the earth like it had something to protect. Fence posts blurred into pale silhouettes. Grass swayed slow and uncertain. A fox trotted at the edge of the tree line, its coat dusted in frost, vanishing before the morning fully arrived. Behind her, the bed creaked. You always wake up this early. Lawson's voice was thick with sleep, rough and soft all at once. Only when I've got something on my mind. He sat up, the quilt falling around his waist. What is it? She didn't turn, only spoke into the window's fog. There's a man, used to work the quartermaster's stables in Fort Benton, Barrick. He saw what happened. He knew I hadn't touched a damn thing, but he kept quiet. Lawson rubbed the sleep from his eyes, jaw working. Why bring him up now? Because I don't want to spend the rest of my life hiding from a lie, she said. I want it buried proper. He rose, stepped up behind her, placed a hand on her shoulder. You want to ride back? She nodded. Not to get even. Just to ask him why. By noon their bags were packed and the horses saddled. Lawson didn't press her for more. She didn't offer. The ride would take them east through low country, across river bends and brittle prairie. They didn't need to speak. The hooves said enough. So did the wind. A fire by the river and a question long. Carried that night, they camped by a shallow bend in the Mariah's River, where the water ran slow and clear between banks of smooth black stones. Dela gathered driftwood while Lawson pitched the canvas, his motions automatic practiced. The fire came alive under her hands, sparked from flint and dry bark until it glowed steady and warm. She sat beside it, legs crossed, hands resting loose on her thighs. You think men like Beric ever think about what they leave behind? Lawson stirred the pot of beans over the fire. Some do. Most don't. If it doesn't bleed them, it ain't theirs to carry. She nodded slow. He was kind once. Gave me gloves when the frost split my hands that first winter. Then the day things turned, he wouldn't even look at me. Lawson handed her a tin plate. She stared at the fire. What will you say if he's still there? I don't know yet. They ate in silence, the kind that wasn't heavy, just honest. Later, when the fire died down to coals and the stars scattered wide overhead, she lay against her saddle arms crossed behind her head. Lawson sat near sharpening a blade by the firelight. He might not be there, she said. I know. And if he is, he might not talk. Then we ride home. She turned her head slightly. It feels strange, having a place to ride back to. He didn't look up, just said quiet. That place has your name on the land now, Dela, whether you stay or not. Her breath caught in her throat. I'll stay. The truth at last, and a ride back changed. They reached Fort Benton the next afternoon. The town was louder than she remembered, wagons clogging the main road. Steamboat whistles echoing from the river bank, dock hands shouting over crates. Dela kept her hat, low coat pulled tight, shadowed by the weight of memory. Lawson led them through the maze of buildings to the old quartermaster's stable. The smell of hay and sweat met them before the place even came into view. A man stood near the corral, pitchfork in hand, his back bent with years. Thinner than she recalled, but still Beric. She dismounted, left Lawson with the horses, and walked to the fence with her hands in her coat pockets. Beric. He turned, eyes wide at first, then narrowed. You're her. I am. You shouldn't be here. I'm not here for trouble. I came for the truth. He set the pitchfork down slowly, like it had grown heavy. You want me to say I lied? No. I want to know why you didn't speak up. Beric wiped a hand across his mouth. Wasn't safe for you, for anyone. The sheriff's boy. His uncle runs the freight line. They could have ruined me. So you let them ruin me instead. He didn't answer. I'm not here to shame you. I just needed to hear it from you. Not the sheriff. Not the town. You. Beric looked away. You have a daughter, she asked. His head snapped back toward her. 2. Then think what it would mean to them if someone did to them what you let happen to me. His face twisted, not in anger, but in something closer to regret. I think about that more than you know. She nodded once, turned, and walked back to Lawson without another word. They left Fort Benton as the sun dipped behind the courthouse steeple, the sky bleeding orange and gray. They didn't speak until the trail had swallowed the town. Did it help? Lawson asked. Dela stared ahead, wind tugging at her collar. Didn't fix anything, but it settled something. A ledger, a name, and a home. Etched in ink, they returned to the ranch 2 days later, beneath a sky that stretched clear and wide, its blue softened by the faint gold haze of early autumn. The wind smelled of dust and pine sap, and the land felt quieter than when they'd left it, like it had held its breath and now exhaled as they crossed the final hill. Dela unpacked slowly, not because she was tired, though she was, but because each movement felt deliberate, like placing a piece of herself back where it belonged. The saddle blanket she folded tight. The coffee tin she tucked into the cupboard. Her boots she left by the back door heels together like they knew they had a place. That evening, as the hearth flickered and the last of the stew simmered low on the stove, Lawson pulled open the drawer near the table. From it, he took an old leather-bound ledger, its spine cracked with time, the pages yellowed with age and ash. He laid it flat before her. "I've been thinking," he said, not looking up. "If we're going to build something, we ought to start writing it down." She looked at him across the table. "Like what names?" "Stock, boundaries, seasons, and yours next to mine." Her voice was smaller than she intended. "You mean that Lawson met her eyes, his gaze steady as fence posts in frozen ground?" "I wouldn't say it if I didn't." She stepped around the table, placed her hand gently over his. "Then write it." And he did, with a pencil dulled from weather in a script that had seen both storm and sun. He wrote her name beneath his own. Dela Orvin. The ink dried slow in the lamplight, and when it finally set, it felt less like a mark on the paper and more like a claim, simple, silent, and whole. Land with her name, and a cabin of her making. The first frost came early that year, curling silver over the tall grass and glinting like lace at the edge of the porch. Dela stepped out into the cold just after dawn, shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there breathing it in the way the air bit, but didn't hurt, the way the soil beneath her boots no longer felt borrowed. Lawson joined her hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the distant rise where the sun was beginning to light the hilltops. "I want to file a land claim," she said, not turning. He didn't look surprised, just nodded once like he'd been waiting for her to say it. "You've been thinking on it since we came back?" "I have," she said, brushing her thumb along her palm. "You told me this place had my name on it. I want to make that true in more than ink. There's a parcel east of the ridge," Lawson said. "Used to be part of my father's range. Been empty 10 years. Would you let it go? I'd rather give it." That afternoon, they rode out together. The trail wound past the upper grove, where cottonwoods leaned over the stream, their branches bending with the weight of coming snow. The land she chose sloped gently toward the trees, a stretch of earth wide enough for a cabin, a garden, and space to breathe. They walked its edge in silence. Her boots sank into the frost-softened grass, and she paused near a scatter of stones half buried beneath moss and thyme. "This is the spot," she said. Lawson dismounted, came to stand beside her. "You sure I'm sure?" The next week passed in the rhythm of building, splitting timber, hauling stone, tying twine to mark corners. Dela worked beside him every hour, never asking what job was his or hers. She carried beams, held nails, wiped sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. At night, they returned to the house, backs sore, fingers scraped, but never tired of each other. A ring, a question, and vows without lace. One evening as Dela stirred stew in the cast-iron pot, Lawson stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching her, like he was memorizing something. "You ever think about marriage?" he asked. She didn't flinch, just stirred slower. "I have." He stepped inside. What did you decide that if I did it again it wouldn't be for a name? It'd be because I trusted the man enough to build something that outlives us both. Lawson nodded once, then turned to the shelf, pulled down a small wrapped bundle, and placed it on the table. She unwrapped it slowly, fingers catching on the worn cloth. Inside was a ring, simple silver, its band worn smooth by decades of use. "My mother's," he said. "My father gave it to her when they built this place. She wore it through every hard season they had." Dela touched the band, turned it once in her hand. "You sure?" she whispered. "I've been sure," he said, "since the day you didn't flinch when I told you the truth mattered more than fear." She looked up, her eyes steady. Then, yes, they married in November, just before the first heavy snow. The preacher rode in from Helena, wrapped in a wool coat and carrying a weathered Bible. The ceremony took place beneath the cottonwoods with only a pair of neighbors and the horses as witness. There was no lace, no ribbons, no grand celebration. Just her in her best blue dress, him in his Sunday coat, and vows spoken with no hesitation. That night they sat close beside the hearth. She rested her head against his shoulder. "Wasn't sure I'd ever be someone's wife again," she said. "You're not just someone's," Lawson replied. "You're mine, and I'm yours." She closed her eyes. It feels good, saying it like that. Here are the expanded versions of segments 13 to 15 each, written in 450 to 600 words, continuing the story's gentle pace, healing tone, and emotional evolution. Seeds in the snow in the shape of a shared life. Their days settled into a rhythm, not rushed, not rehearsed, but steady, like a song sung without need for a second verse. The cabin on Dela's land rose beam by beam, each nail a mark of intention, each plank a piece of permanence. The wood creaked like it welcomed her weight, like it had waited for someone to belong to. Though she spent most of her daylight tending the homestead, marking out a garden beneath the snow, feeding the chickens, learning the stubborn moods of her goats, she always returned to the ranch house at evening. Always. It became a quiet promise neither of them had to speak aloud. Some nights they shared bread and stew. Other nights just tea and silence, but the kind of silence that holds warmth, not absence. Dela mended old fence gloves by the fire, while Lawson whittled handles for tools or carved out small wooden animals he never admitted were for her. By late winter, she had a proper coop, 2 hens that laid regular, and a stubborn rooster that hated everyone equally. Lawson built her a cedar chest for seed sacks, lining it with sheepskin to keep the frost from creeping in. When her hands cracked from the cold, he wrapped them in his own gloves and told her, "You can't work the land if you don't let it work you back." The sheriff from Fort Benton never came again. Maybe he heard what he needed to. Maybe he knew better. Word traveled quiet in those parts. Whispers had a way of shifting shape. With Berwick's confession sent by mail weeks after their visit, Dela's name had begun to unspool from the snare it had been tied in. People in town no longer glanced sideways. They nodded now, sometimes even smiled. And in March, standing on her porch, shawl swept over one shoulder, Dela watched Lawson ride up the hill. Patches of snow melted behind his boots as he dismounted. He didn't say much. Just stepped beside her, took her hand like it was something he'd always meant to do. "Garden's ready," she said. He kissed her palm. "So are we." Laughter nails and the start of something new. Spring came slow that year, dragging its heels through mud and leftover frost, but they met it together. Dela planted the first rows with her sleeves rolled up and her hair tied back. Carrots, beets, a bed of wild greens. She laughed when the goats chewed the hem of her skirt and Lawson didn't stop them. Just said, "They've got taste, I'll give them that." He carved a bench for her porch, rough-hewn but sturdy. They sat there often in the evenings, watching the sky shift from gold to violet. The quiet between them changed less like silence and more like breath. One afternoon, as he replaced a warped fence rail, Dela fetched the hammer without being asked, held the nails in her palm like she'd done it her whole life. "You think the sheriff will ever ride back through?" she asked, eyes tracking the road beyond the field. "If he does," Lawson said, "he won't find what he's looking for." She hesitated. "I don't want you in trouble." He looked up, met her eyes. "I've been in worse for less reason." "You're not trouble," he added, voice low. She stepped closer. "You keep saying things like that. I might start acting like it." He didn't touch her, just let the moment rest there between them, full and solid. That night she didn't wait for him to light the lantern. She did it herself. Set the table, ladled soup into bowls, and when she sat down, it was like she'd never left. A dress, a dance, and the weight of words unspoken. It was after supper when she said it. "There's a church social this weekend." Lawson raised an eyebrow. "You planning to go?" She twisted a spoon in her bowl. "Maybe. If you'd walk in with me." He didn't answer right away. Just leaned back in his chair. "Then if I walk in, I won't walk out alone." She looked up, startled, then nodded. Outside, the wind rattled the eaves. Inside, the fire cracked. It was warm and steady and full of everything they weren't quite ready to name. Later, after the dishes were stacked and the lantern turned low, she stood beside him at the hearth. "I used to think love was a trick," she said. "Something folks used to get what they wanted. Now," she turned her face toward him, eyes clear, "now I think it might be a kind of work." "A choice?" he asked, reaching for her hand, rough and calloused like his. "Then let's choose it," he said. She didn't answer with words, just leaned her head against his shoulder and let herself be still. Outside, the moon rose over the ridge. The wind moved soft through the grass, and for the first time in either of their lives there was no running left to do. Onto town, together, one step toward the light. The morning of the social, the town stirred earlier than usual. Wagons creaked along the road. Dust rose in curls behind horse hooves. Children ran between storefronts with ribbons in their hair and smudges on their cheeks. From the edge of the trail, Dela could see it all, people gathering fiddles, being tuned porch rails draped with bunting and wild flowers. Lawson rode beside her in silence. He didn't wear anything fancy, just his cleanest shirt, the buttons stitched back by her own hand. She wore her blue dress, the one from the wedding, hem mended twice and pressed smooth that morning. Her braid was neat. Her hands stayed at her sides, but the tension in her neck betrayed the fight inside her. They reached the general store first. Lawson dismounted, tied both horses to the post, and held the door without saying a word. Inside, the scent of molasses and wood smoke wrapped around them. The shelves were stacked with flour sacks, bolts of cloth oil tins, and enough noise to make Dela pause just inside the threshold. "I'll see if Tom's got that wire," Lawson said, his voice low and steady. "You need anything?" She glanced at a rack of sewing supplies. "Maybe half a yard of canvas. Mine's tearing at the seams." He nodded and stepped toward the back. Dela moved carefully, not brushing too close to anyone. She didn't try to disappear, but she didn't announce herself either. At the counter stood a woman in her 50s, silver braid wrapped tight, eyes sharp, but not cruel. She looked up. "You're Neil's girl." Dela didn't flinch. "I work his land." The woman eyed her. "You sew well enough," Dela nodded. The woman cut the cloth clean, folded it, and handed it over without comment. No questions. No coins asked. Outside, the street had grown louder. Fiddlers played near the church steps. Children dashed past the water trough, kicking up laughter and dust. "You all right?" Lawson asked, adjusting the saddlebag strap. Dela nodded once. "Feels strange, standing still. That'll pass." They stayed long enough for her to buy coarse thread and for Lawson to shake hands with the feed store owner. Then, as the sun dipped lower, they turned back up the trail, quiet but content. A window, a question, and the weight of comfort. That evening, as the wind stirred softly through the shutters, Dela sat by the open window with her sewing in her lap. Her lips moved as she counted stitches, eyes narrowed in focus. The fabric was old canvas, patched and worn, but she worked it like it was something worth saving. Lawson watched her from the table. The oil lamp cast a golden light on her profile, soft, weathered, strong. She looked like she belonged in that house, like she'd been built into its walls. "You always mend things yourself?" he asked. "If I can. You ever think about making something new instead?" She looked up. "Like what blanket? Shirt? Maybe a dress?" She considered that thread loop through her fingers. "Never thought I'd stay in one place long enough to need one. You are now." She set the fabric aside, stood slowly crossed to where he sat. "I don't know what to do with comfort," she said quietly. "It feels like a trap sometimes." "It's not," he said. "It's just waiting." "For what? For you to trust it." She reached out, touched his arm. "I trust you." He stood, close enough that she had to tilt her chin to meet his eyes. "You don't have to earn your place here," he said. "You already have it." She inhaled, her chest rising just slightly. "I used to dream about someone saying that." He brushed his fingers along her cheek. "It's real now." She kissed him slow, steady, without urgency. Just warmth. Later, when the kettle cooled and the fire dimmed, she lay beside him, hand resting over his heart. "I want to build something here," she said. "Not just stay." "We will," he answered, bit by bit. Outside, the horses shifted in their stalls. Inside, the quiet wasn't silence. It was the sound of something lasting, the first light and a decision that would not be denied. The morning after their return to town, Dela woke before the first light. The room was still the kind of still that came only with trust. She stepped out from under the quilt, careful not to wake Lawson. His breathing was even one arm thrown across the bed like a promise he didn't need to speak aloud. She crossed the room barefoot, the floor chilled beneath her. At the basin, she rinsed her hands and stared out the small window. Mist clung to the fields, softening the fence line and blurring the tops of the pines. The earth looked gentle, like it might forgive everything. A fox moved along the tree line, silent and unseen except for its tail flicking through the fog. Behind her, the bed creaked. "You always wake up this early?" Lawson asked, voice heavy with sleep. "Only when I've got something on my mind." He sat up. "What is it?" She didn't turn. "There's a man in Fort Benton. Barrick. He knew I was innocent. He saw everything, and he kept quiet." Lawson didn't speak, just waited. "I don't want to spend the rest of my life hiding from that," she said. "I want to bury it proper." He rose, crossed to her, set his hand on her shoulder. "You want to ride back?" She nodded. "Not for revenge, just to ask why." By noon the saddlebags were packed with bread-dried meat and apples. They rode east through scrub and wind into land that didn't remember them but welcomed their return. They didn't talk much. The sound of hooves and wind said all that needed saying. Here are the expanded versions of segments 19 to 21, each written in 450, 600 words, preserving the story's introspective tone, character depth, and slow-burning emotional resonance. A man with a pitchfork, and a truth too, late Fort Benton came into view under a high dry sky. The sun cast long shadows behind wagons loaded with crates, while dockhands shouted orders near the steamboat moored at the river's edge. It was busier than she remembered, more alive, more indifferent. Dela kept her hat pulled low, her coat drawn tight. Familiar places loomed around her like ghosts. Lawson led the way, weaving between carts and storefronts, until they reached the stables tucked behind the old quartermaster's post. There, near a corral thick with hay and the low murmur of restless horses, stood Beric. His back was slightly stooped. His pitchfork rose and fell in a rhythm too slow to be hurried, too tired to be proud. His hair, once thick and dark, had thinned into silver patches beneath the brim of his cap. Dela dismounted. Lawson stayed with the horses, quiet, his presence steady but unobtrusive. She walked toward the fence boots, crunching over gravel. Beric. He turned at the sound of her voice. His eyes widened, then narrowed, recognition creeping in like a tide. You're her. I am. He glanced behind her. You shouldn't be here. I'm not here for trouble, she said. I came for the truth. He set the pitchfork down slowly as if it had grown heavier in her presence. You want me to say I lied? No, she replied. I want to know why you didn't speak up. He wiped his hand across his mouth. It wasn't safe for you for anyone. The sheriff's boy. His uncle runs half the freight line. They could have ruined me. So instead, you let them ruin me. He looked away, shame etching into the corners of his mouth. He didn't deny it. I'm not here to shame you, she said softly. I just needed to hear it from you, not the sheriff, not the town, you. His shoulders dropped, voice ragged. You have a daughter. He looked at her sharply. 2. Then think what it would mean to them. If someone did to them what you let happen to me. He didn't answer. His face twitched, not with anger, but grief. I think about that more than you know, he whispered. She nodded, just once, and turned back to Lawson without another word. A trail behind and something settled inside. They left Fort Benton before the sun dipped behind the courthouse steeple. The trail wound westward, long and dry beneath their horses' hooves. They didn't speak until the town was a shape in the distance, and even then the words came slow. Did it help? Lawson asked. Dela didn't look at him right away. Her gaze stayed fixed on the horizon where blue met gold and the land stretched wider than her thoughts could follow. Didn't fix anything, she said after a pause, but it settled something. He nodded. That was enough. 2 days later, they returned to the ranch. The sky was clear, crisp, and the air carried the clean scent of wind-washed pine. Dela unpacked with care her saddlebag, her gloves, the folded cloth she'd bought in town. Each item had its place now, and so did she. That night, as the fire popped low in the hearth, Lawson reached to the drawer near the stove and pulled out the ledger again. But this time his hand hovered longer before he opened it. I've been thinking, he said, voice quiet. About what? If we're going to build something, we ought to start writing it down. Together. She raised an eyebrow. Like what stock, weather, boundaries? He turned the page. And your name? Next to mine. You mean that he looked at her, then really looked? I wouldn't say it if I didn't. She stepped to him, hand resting lightly on his, then righted. And he did. The pencil moved slow across the page. Lawson, then Dela, not just side by side, but tethered. The lamplight glowed over the ink. Outside, the wind had gone still. Inside, something rooted. Frost and a future measured in steps. The frost came early that year, white, soft, and almost silent. It spread across the pasture like spilled light, edging the blades of grass, cloaking the fence posts, turning the earth into something other, worldly and still. Dela stepped outside just after dawn, her shawl wrapped tight, her boots crunching against the frozen ground. But for the first time she wasn't startled by the cold. It greeted her like something known. Lawson joined her a moment later, hands in his coat pockets, eyes fixed on the far ridge where pale light was beginning to bloom. He didn't speak, not at first. Mornings were always hers to break the silence if she chose. "I want to file a land claim," she said. He didn't turn, just nodded like he'd expected it. "You've been thinking on it." "I have." She exhaled breath curling in the air. "You said this land had my name on it. I want to make that true in more than ink." He studied her face, then quiet calm, resolved. "There's a parcel just east of the ridge. It used to be part of my father's range. It's been sitting empty 10 years. Would you let it go? I'd rather give it." That afternoon they saddled up and rode out past the upper grove, where the cottonwoods bent low over the stream. The land she chose sloped gently the way a hand rests when it's finally at peace. Enough flat ground for a cabin, room for a garden, shelter from the wind. She walked its edge boots, pressing frost into the grass. Near a small cluster of stones half buried, she stopped. "This is the spot," she said. Lawson dismounted, came to stand beside her. "You sure?" "I'm sure." They didn't speak again. Not then. They just stood there in the silence of choosing with the land wide open around them. Twine timber and the language of work. They returned the next morning with tools and twine, the frost still clinging to the edges of the tall grass. The sky overhead was pale blue, veined with thin clouds drifting slow, like breath. There was no speech between them as they unpacked, no declaration of purpose. Just motion, intention, a rhythm that required no sound. They marked the corners, first driving stakes into the soil, tying lines of twine between them. Then came timber, hauled in from a grove down by the creek, stripped and measured, each cut echoing like punctuation across the field. Dela didn't wait for instruction. She worked beside Lawson with sleeves rolled up hands, quick and confident. Her strength wasn't loud. It was built from grit and memory. She carried rock for the foundation-lashed bundles of thatch and patched the top that served as a roof until the real one could be built. When they paused to drink from the canteen, they did so without ceremony, just leaning back against the half-framed wall of what would be her home. Each day ended with aching backs and blistered palms, but neither complained. Their silences were full of agreement, full of motion toward something that was finally theirs. At night, they returned to the ranch house. The porch creaked under their weight. The fire greeted them like an old friend. She peeled off her gloves, laid them flat beside the hearth, and stirred the stew without being asked. There was no need to ask anymore. They understood what each other needed before words. A ring reborn and a marriage meant for weathering. One evening, just after the sky had turned copper and the air carried that hush that comes before the first real snow, Lawson stood in the kitchen doorway watching Dela stir the pot. Her hair was tied back, loose strands brushing her cheeks, and the light from the stove softened every hard line the past had carved. "You ever think about marriage?" he asked. She paused, spoon mid-turn. "I have." He stepped inside, boots scuffing the worn floorboards. "What did you decide that if I did it again, it wouldn't be for the name? It'd be because I trusted the man enough to build something that outlives us both." Lawson nodded once, then reached up to a shelf and brought down a small bundle wrapped in flannel. He set it on the table between them. She looked at it, then at him. "Go on." She unwrapped it slowly, careful not to tear the cloth. Inside was a simple silver ring, dull with age but unmarred. The band was smooth from decades of wear. It glinted faintly in the firelight. "My mother's," he said. "My father gave it to her when they built this place. She wore it through every hard season." Dela touched the ring, running her thumb along the edge. "You sure I've been sure since the day you stood on that hill and said you were ready to build something." She met his gaze, steady and sure as any vow, and said, "Then yes." They were married in November beneath the cottonwoods, the first heavy snow still a few days off. The preacher came from Helena, wrapped in a wool coat and carrying a Bible that had seen more grief than joy. Only 2 neighbor families came to witness their children clutching scarves and craning their necks to see. There were no flowers, no music, no lace. Just her in her best blue dress, him in his Sunday coat, and the words "I do" said without hesitation. That night, they sat close beside the hearth, hands twined firelight, painting shadows on the wall. "I wasn't sure I'd ever be someone's wife again," she whispered. "You're not just someone's," Lawson said. "You're mine, and I'm yours." She rested her head on his shoulder, and the quiet they shared wasn't empty. It was full. Season by season, a life that holds their lives settled into something honest. Not perfect, not always smooth, but real, built from hands. Sweat and the kind of love that shows up even when words don't. The cabin on her claim rose beam by beam until it stood firm against the wind. By early spring, the walls had been sealed tight and she moved in officially, but every evening she still returned to the ranch house. Not out of habit, out of belonging. They shared meals, repaired tools. Sometimes they sat on the porch with only the sounds of wind and crickets to keep them company. And it was enough. By late winter, she had a coop of hens and 2 stubborn goats that followed her like dogs. The beginnings of a garden waited under the frost, marked with sticks and string. Lawson built her a cedar chest for seeds, his hands careful, his work precise. When her hands cracked, he rubbed sheepskin balm into her palms. When he caught a cough, she wrapped his chest with warm cloth and fed him broth until he stopped fighting her about it. The sheriff from Fort Benton never came back. Barrick's confession, mailed in quiet handwriting, had traveled farther than they expected. The boy's disappearance had been linked to his own recklessness, not theft. Dela's name was no longer whispered in doubt, but spoken aloud with a kind of earned respect. When she walked into town, folks nodded. Some even smiled. In March, she stood on her porch and watched Lawson ride up the hill, the snow melting in patches behind him. He dismounted, stepped beside her, and took her hand. "The garden's ready," she said. He kissed her palm. "So are we." They planted together that spring, hands in the dirt, shoulders brushing. She laughed when the goats chewed her skirt. He built a bench for her porch. They sat there often watching the seasons turn, and with each passing day, the land remembered them. Echoes of storms and the quiet, they built together. The seasons came and went the way they always did, slow at first, then sudden. Rain turned to heat to wind, and wind to chill. Through it all, the house stood firm. The barn filled, the fences held, and the land, once wild beneath Dela's boots, learned the shape of her footsteps and didn't flinch. Friends began to stop by. Not many, but enough. A neighbor dropping off cuttings for her garden. A rancher asking Lawson for help with wintering stock. There was no fanfare, no welcome banners, but each handshake felt like a stone added to a foundation no one could tear loose now. Together they endured the long hours, the dry spells, the goat that kept chewing through the same fence slat. They fixed what needed fixing and left the rest until morning. They shared tools and sometimes temper. But every evening when the light slipped low behind the ridge, they returned to the porch. Always the porch. One summer night when the sky burned lavender and the air smelled of pine and warmed grass, Dela walked barefoot across the ridge. The light touched her skin like a blessing. Her hair was tied back, but wisps had come free in the wind. She moved like she had nothing to run from, nothing to prove. Lawson waited where the grass bent soft against the sky. He stood with his hands calloused and still his eyes holding the same question he always did. "Are you still here?" And every time the answer had been yes. "You ever wish things had gone different?" she asked. He didn't take his eyes off her. "Not once. Not since you." She smiled quiet and full. Then she leaned in, kissed him slow, and knew without hesitation this was the life she had built, and the love that had built her back, and it would hold. Stillness is a kind of strength. In the quiet that followed the heat of summer, Dela found herself tending more than just soil. She mended what was worn, sharpened what had dulled. Her movements, once frantic with the need to survive, had taken on the patience of someone who knew she belonged. Some mornings, she woke before the sun and sat on the porch with a cup of coffee watching the light draw long fingers across the fields. She didn't speak, didn't think about who might come looking for her. Those days were done. The girl who had crouched behind a barn with blood on her lip and a pistol in her hand. That girl was still part of her, but she no longer steered the reins. Lawson understood. He didn't ask questions she wasn't ready to answer. He just walked beside her, mending fences, hauling water, warming her gloves on the stove before handing them over. The first time she ventured back into Helena alone, it was to buy seed. She walked into the mercantile with her head high, her name no longer whispered. The shopkeep, a man who hadn't even looked at her before, tipped his hat. No questions, no lingering eyes, just respect, earned and kept. Later that day, as she rode back with burlap sacks strapped behind the saddle, the sky broke open with rain. She laughed, soaked and grinning, as the water hit her skin, and galloped the rest of the way home. Lawson met her on the porch, towel in hand, grin wide. "You planning on bringing that storm inside with you?" "I am the storm," she teased. And he pulled her into the warmth anyway. Where the land ends, they begin. Again. Years passed, though neither of them counted them. They measured time by harvests, by snowfall, by how long it took the porch bench to wear smooth under their hands. The land remembered them, in the way the soil stayed soft under her garden, in the way the creek near the grove ran clearer, in the way foxes didn't startle when she crossed the ridge. The cabin stood firm. They added a small room one year, a second window the next. Never grand, never fancy, but every beam was touched by their hands, and in every corner the scent of cedar and a shared life lingered. One evening after supper, and the dishes had been put away, Lawson took her hand and led her out into the grass. The moon was rising full and gold. They walked, slow fingers laced without needing to say a thing. "I want to keep planting here," Dela whispered. "Even when the world forgets we're out here." "It never will," Lawson said. "Not while we're part of it." They stood at the edge of the ridge. Wind in their hair, stars overhead, no fences in sight, only the soft rustle of the earth breathing, and though they didn't speak, it both knew something that didn't need saying. They were no longer the sum of their scars or the weight of old names. They were this place now, and this place was them. An epilogue. Beneath the cottonwoods, years didn't pass like numbers for Dela and Lawson. They moved like seasons, each one layering itself into the wood grain of their home, the folds of their clothes, the lines beside their eyes. Nothing ever rushed them. The world outside might have spun faster towns, growing louder, and rail lines cutting through old paths, but on their ridge above the stream, life remained honest. The garden bloomed fuller each spring. Dela planted herbs between rows of onions and squash, swore by her grandmother's tricks, and swatted at Lawson when he tried to sneak the first ripe tomato. The goats grew fat and stubborn. The hens laid eggs like clockwork. The cabin, once bare and simple, became a living map of their journey curtains. She'd sewn herself shelves he'd built for her sewing box, hooks for coats worn soft at the elbows. Sometimes neighbors stopped by with cornbread or gossip. Sometimes they didn't. The silence never bothered either of them. Dela found peace in the rhythm of work, in the soft creak of the porch swing, in Lawson's hand, brushing hers when he passed the coffee pot. Their love wasn't something that needed proving. It just was. Like water in the creek, like pine needles on the wind. On the anniversary of their wedding, they always returned to the cottonwoods. It wasn't a ceremony, just a tradition. No words spoken, no flowers brought. They'd ride out in the afternoon, tie their horses to the fence, and sit where they'd stood years before, young and scarred and brave enough to try. One year, Dela brought a small wooden box wrapped in cloth. She didn't say what it was, just set it in Lawson's hands and waited. Inside a journal, hand-stitched, pages filled in her careful slanted writing. She'd written down the story of how they met, not as fact, but as memory. "You wrote all this?" Lawson asked, voice lower than usual. She nodded. "For when we're old, or gone, or when someone asks how we came to build a life from nothing." Lawson turned the pages slow, like each one was sacred. At the end, she'd left a blank page. "For whatever comes next," she said. He closed the book, pressed his hand over the cover, and kissed her soft as spring wind. That winter, the snow came early again, just like the year she'd first arrived. But this time, it didn't feel like a storm. It felt like a hush, a full breath. Dela stood in the porch as it fell, flakes catching on her shawl. She didn't shiver, just watched the horizon, remembering what it felt like to run and what it took to stop. Lawson came up beside her, slid an arm around her waist. "It's a good place," he said. "It is," she answered. "Because we stayed, because they did. Through fire and frost, silence and song, they stayed. And the land, wise, patient, and vast, held them both. Always,